It's the Bleav in Texans podcast brought to you by FanDuel. And look, we here in Houston haven't had a whole lot of experience with either celebrating or criticizing first-round picks these last few years. Ever since Will Anderson, we've been bereft of these first-round picks. So I tend to skew more towards the positive, the optimistic, the rose-colored glasses, and yet I know it's a weakness of mine this time of year. So over the course of the last few hours or 18 hours, however many it's been, I've been jotting down, all right, what are the key concerns I'm seeing on the radio show this morning, on X, in my YouTube comments, all of that. Some understandable concerns about the Texans draft pick, or even with some people who have unbridled positivity. Still, some questions about Keylan Rutledge. What does it mean? Was this the right pick? What did they reach? All of these things. I want to go through all of these things, not to try to set your mind at ease, but to check myself. Check the old blind spot for what I might be missing on as I start to come down to earth again. But we'll get into the second, third, and fourth rounds, and I'll be, boom, right back up there. Right now, the Texans are at plus 2,000 to win the Super Bowl. The Rams are still the favorite at plus 700 on FanDuel because what were they going to do? Improve without them drafting anybody other than a quarterback who's not going to play at all this year? They have an injury on the offensive line. Ty Simpson. He's not gonna step in there and fill in for Havenstein, as John Harris pointed out this morning. So really the big question is, we know, as I've established and talked about so many times already on various shows, it's that the Texans went after Keylan Rutledge in large part because, man, they are looking to get more physical, more aggressive, tougher when it comes to run blocking. And that's awesome, in my opinion. But there's some drawbacks that come with that. And I think the number one thing that I've seen that has been coming up for a few years now, really, with every one of the last four Texans offensive linemen who were drafted in the first couple rounds is, did they overdraft him? And I've seen this comment continually, especially going back to Kenyon Green, the perception that, man, they could have gotten him later, et cetera, et cetera. I anticipated this with Keylan Rutledge because he was not buzzed about a lot until these last couple weeks as a guy who could potentially be a first rounder. If you look at where his draft status was in the mock drafts going back to January, back in January, he was in the fourth round and later. And that's what people looked at him as. And then he steadily started to rise through the combine, through buzz from other people. But these last couple of weeks, he started to hear a lot of people say, hey, this guy could go in the first round, including John Harris. We had John Harris on the radio a few days ago, and he said that exact same thing. This is where I think sometimes there's a disconnect between the concept of a late riser when people talk about it in the media. Usually what that actually is people in the media catching on to what some teams are thinking about with a guy like Keylan Rutledge. Chase Pasantis, if he had gone in the first round, is another guy who I think is similar, and I've talked about Chase Pasantis a lot more than I've talked about Keylan Rutledge. The other part of it is, okay, not only did you draft him higher than people expected, but you traded up for him. Depending on which draft chart you're using, it was anywhere from a fourth or a fifth round pick, the equivalence of a fourth or a fifth round pick when you add up the points to trade up a couple of spots for him. I think that there's two things here. One is that Caserio, I don't think all that often falls in love with a player or feels committed to a player. And when he does, I give him a pass on it because you just don't want the GM who's continually falling in love with players more so than the rest of the league is. The other part of it is that every draft board is different. And what one team might think a player A is awesome, but it's not what they're looking for, or it doesn't fit their scheme, or whatever it might be. So he likes player B more. That doesn't mean that if another team has player A higher, then that's a bad rating by the individual team. I think with the Texans, the important thing to remember is that it's a very, very, very good. There is a very good chance that there was another team or two that also liked Keylan Rutledge, and the Texans had a good feel for who that team was and what they were trying to do at that point in the draft. In this particular situation, more so than in some other ones, I feel pretty strongly about that. And it's not just that San Francisco traded back immediately after the Texans drafted Keylan Rutledge. I think there's more to it than that, but I'm not overly concerned about that. Now, if they had traded aggressively and they had given away huge chunks of draft capital, I might feel differently about it right this moment. But I think Caserio doesn't fall in love too easily, but when he does, they fell in love. Caserio and D'Amico and everybody else fell in love with Will Anderson. This is a little bit of a muted version of the Will Anderson love, because Caserio talked in the press conference last night about how he just checked off so many boxes in terms of certain traits that they value a lot. I'm guessing those had to do with the physicality and the run blocking and those things, because that's been the theme of this offseason, that he was just the best guy in terms of some of those dynamics with the offensive lineman. So I'm not concerned about that right now. Second biggest thing I see is the pass protection concerns, questions about technique, and obviously protecting CJ Stroud. This is one that I'm in love with the process right now. I'm in love with the theory. I need to see it executed, but it's this, that you turn guys into better pass protectors when you are actually a really effective running football team, because the play action becomes that much more effective. And, people in the analytics side of things will argue left and right about whether it's actually important to have a good rushing attack, to have a good play action game, et cetera, et cetera. I'll tell you this, you need to at the very least have a credible rushing attack if you want the play action to work. Because what happens is, if you don't run the ball well on first down, well, it's 2nd and 10. And you know what? The play action ain't working for nobody on 2nd and 10. Teams are going to call it in such a way and play it in such a way that you might run the ball and great, you'll get a few yards, but then it's still 3rd and 5 or 3rd and 6. So because you don't have a good rushing attack to even capitalize on running the ball on 2nd and 10. The Texans' run game has been atrocious. So I think they've graded out a lot better as pass protectors the last couple years, but it's all for naught when you're just incapable of running the football. So even if they don't end up with a top rushing offense, they've committed themselves this year to saying, we have to give this quarterback at the very least a viable rushing attack. So I get that you have the concerns about it, because Keylan Rutledge grades, the various scouting reports would say he's a much better run blocker than pass protector. I get all of that. Their process this year is to fix the running game first and foremost, and that makes everybody a better pass protector. It makes CJ a better quarterback, all of those things. The third concern, I guess I would classify it as day one readiness. Is he a plug-and-play starter, or is he developmental? And I don't know if that's how people have framed it exactly, but the concern is, okay, you draft this guy, you've already got 2 veteran guards that you just gave contracts to. You've got Wyatt Teller at left guard. You've got Ed Ingram at right guard. And did you draft this guy just to be a center? I don't think you drafted him just to be a center, but I think he's going to compete with Jake Andrews for the starting center spot. If Wyatt Teller goes down, or if Ed Ingram goes down, both those guys missed games with injuries last year. Wyatt Teller's on the wrong side of 30. And the chance of him having to play this year, or getting to play this year, is very, very high. And the options right now, if Keylan Rutledge works out as a draft prospect, are it's a lot better than what we had before on the backups at the interior offensive line. No disrespect to Evan Brown, but he's been with 6 or 7 different teams in his career, and the upside for him is just not nearly as high. Texans, by the way, are plus 950 to win the AFC on FanDuel right now. We'll see at the end of the draft if any of these odds change by next week. The fourth concern, his medical issues and or durability. So as many of you know by now, he had a really bad car accident a few years ago, had complications with it, almost theoretically could have lost his foot, which really would have driven him down in the draft. It's rare. It's rare that you see a guy with 1 foot as an NFL offensive lineman. The last 2 years, he's played 13 out of 13 games. And 1 game this past season, he limped off late in game 1, but he's also played through a lot of injuries. There's 1 game where he had a bloody face all over the place. That car crash is the big thing. I think there's a little bit of PTSD, I think. And by the way, in 2022 and 2023, he played in 11 games in each of those seasons. It was the car crash in 2023 that was pretty devastating, but he's been healthy since then. I think the PTSD comes from, hey, yeah, wait, Juice Scruggs came back from a car accident, didn't he? That was one of the things that they pointed to is, hey, he overcame adversity. Like, that's cool. It's cool if you overcome adversity, but you also don't want it to maybe lead to some issues down the line or something. He's played through 2 full seasons since that point, and I would say, just knocking on wood and crossing my fingers, I wouldn't anticipate that being an issue, anything above and beyond what other players already have. I'm looking at MSN.com has a write-up on his injury history, and they do point out that he has a history of frequent nosebleeds. And I'm wondering if that's an AI joint, which has come from – I'll have to look into that. I apologize for not being more studied on that right off the bat. But unless he goes on IR with a nosebleed, we won't worry about it until then. Fifth thing is a concern that now – after spending the first few days of free agency complaining about whether the Texans are aggressively addressing the offensive line enough, now there's people that are saying, whoa there. This porridge is too hot now. It was too cold the first few days, but then you went out and you signed Braden Smith. You went out and you got Wyatt Teller, and now you're drafting a guy into what seems like an increasingly crowded interior offensive line. This is too much. I don't have this concern whatsoever. Because the Texans, as we've discussed, they went into this draft sitting at that spot where you want to sit, which is you don't feel like you have any drastic needs to fill anywhere else on the team. I'd love to get more competitive at center, but if they have to roll in this season, if they had to roll into the season with Jake Andrews as their center, I'd be cool with that, with him having those 2 veteran guards next to him. But going back to Wyatt Teller's age, the importance of depth on the offensive line to begin with, and then having guys that can be here not just for this season. Remember, the draft is about what are you going to get out of these guys over the course of the next few years. They still need to keep bolstering the depth in the development, the pipeline. Let's think about some of these young offensive linemen, almost like the farm system is in baseball, because Trent Brown's on the wrong side of 30 as well. Braden Smith is up there. Can't remember if he's 30 or 29. They need more young guys. Ariante Ursary is a good start, but they need to keep building this. And when you've got a guy in CJ Stroud that, man, at some point in the next 365 days, I want to be feeling like, oh, okay, this is what CJ Stroud looks like when you surround him with the right pieces on offense. I'd like to continue that on, especially after CJ Stroud starts, potentially getting paid more money. I'd like to have a few guys that are still on the rookie contract. So that's really not a concern for me. When we get to a little bit later, after we go through these concerns, I want to look at the best players available. I am probably right now most concerned about the depth of the defensive ends and the pass rush presence that they lost with the two veterans that they let go of, or that remain unsigned as of yet. So I think Danico Autry's probably going to retire. But so the continued investment in the offensive line, I'm okay with this. I would like them to continue to add and bolster to the offensive line as much as possible. The number 6, this I haven't seen as much, and it's the lack of flash, not drafting a skill position player or a more high impact player. I haven't seen this much, and frankly, I saw some of this on other teams' Reddits, that there was more people criticizing the Texans, like, what are you guys doing? You're not even getting any better. You already got an offensive line. You already got 2 guards. I think the reason there's not as much blowback from Texans fans is that we have been in O-line purgatory. And we are that fan base that is sitting and waiting and wondering, oh my gosh, where are these big fat men I was promised? Where is my big lovable chubby teddy bear that goes out and plays like a savage teddy bear? They've started to build that up. I personally don't mind. I don't mind if they draft 2 more offensive linemen in this draft. I'm really intrigued to see if they draft any centers. We'll get to that in a little bit. But the interior offensive line compared to what would they have drafted? Caden McDonald, the defensive tackle, was on the board. There's still multiple good cornerbacks. The wide receiver position, a guy like Denzel Boston, who is still available. At this point, I think the Texans, they like Jaden Higgins. I think they like Jalen Noel. And they certainly love Nico Collins. So to go after a skill position guy right now on offense, I don't think that those guys would have been able to show as much of what they can do until we know for sure that the offensive line is fixed. So I didn't really have an appetite for that. I was all about the big guys in the first round and, either at offensive line, defensive line, possibly a linebacker, although I was a little bit skeptical of that. We'll talk about some of that in a bit. And then the final is just the scheme / identity question, the philosophy of leaning into power football in a quarterback-driven league. And I've covered a lot of this already, but I think there's some people that, man, and I understand this 100%. They think, okay, wait a second, you are really focused in on the run game right now, and that's not what the NFL is all about. Things are changing. The pendulum is swinging back towards the importance of the run game. The teams ran the ball last year more frequently than they have in a long time. We're seeing a lot of offenses play 3 tight end sets. I think if the Texans had 3 healthy tight ends at any point last year, they would have run a lot more 3 tight end sets instead of the 6-0 line package at times. I think that they like the 6-0 line package, but they didn't have enough guys to actually still be maulers in a 6 offensive line package. And the vogueness of, being a passing oriented league or being a passing team in a passing oriented league, that's not quite what it was. There are young men and women out there who are heavily into analytics who have grown up since they first learned how to do calculus, knowing nothing but, wow, those people that care about running the football, they are dinosaurs. Boy, I can't believe they talk about that. And truth be told, we were for a while. But I do think that now what's happening is the analytics are suggesting that there's a lot more value in running the ball than there was before, because everybody jumps onto one bandwagon. You start losing that advantage that you do have. But where we are also is it's a league full of offensive coordinators and defensive coordinators that don't actually know how to run the ball or stop the run. And it's really been frustrating. It's been so frustrating for me to watch as a kind of a dinosaur. Like I've gotten with the times over the years. But I grew up in an era where if you're an offense and a team showed you a bunch of cover 2, you just run the ball all over them until they stop you. You just continue to maul them and punish them and destroy them until they can't. And now you see offensive coordinators that don't know what to do when they we can't pass the ball. Why not? Because they're playing cover 2. Like, yeah, this is simple stuff, except you don't know how to engineer a run game. It's one of my biggest issues with Bobby Slowick was I don't think he actually understood blocking, the nuts and bolts of blocking. I think Kaylee has a better understanding of that. When we get into best players available, as we enter day 2 of the draft, some of you will be watching this before we actually enter day 2 of the draft. But the nice thing about the way the draft played out this year is that if you only have a number 28 overall pick, I know people had their designs on other offensive linemen than the one they ended up taking. But some of the guys that we had our designs on, like Caden McDonald, who I like a lot as a defensive tackle, he's still available because there was a bunch of defensive tackles that you kind of looked at as, man, they might sneak into the first round, but these guys really feel more like second rounders. My goodness, they're in a good spot with defensive tackles if they choose to take any of these guys in the second round. Caden McDonald, I've compared him to Tim Settle, and that's not a direct comparison. It's just by way of showing that, look, you're going to see in the scouting reports that he probably doesn't project to be a great pass rusher. I agree. And yet there's way more to rushing the passer from the inside than just pressures and sacks. If you think back to a guy like Vince Wilfork, I don't know how many sacks he ever had in any given season. I know he had a couple years where he had more than you'd expect from a nose tackle, but his real power was that he was a big menacing presence, but he gave great push in the pocket and made quarterbacks uncomfortable, whether you're coming free and whether you're getting skinny and clearing your hips and getting a sack. Yeah, that's great to have. But sometimes it's even better to have a massive body that just presses the pocket, and quarterbacks have to step back. Quarterbacks have to flush the pocket, and you feed Will Anderson, you feed Danielle Hunter. And I think that there's very much that element to Caden McDonald's game. And you get down to just the names of Tristan Miller, Lee Hunter, Dominique Orange, Tyler, whose name I never pronounced correctly, Onyedim. I'm sorry to Aggies who are offended by my mispronunciation. If the Texans draft him, I will. I promise I'll get that straight. There's a little bit more of a nose tackle, run stuffing feel to a lot of those guys, but some of them also have a lot higher upside. Christian Miller intrigues me, partly because he went to Georgia, and we know the Texans love defensive players who went to Georgia just because of the way they're coached there. They had him in on a top 30 visit. I think his personality reminds me a lot of Kamari Lassiter, just high energy, all about showing love to his teammates and everything. It'd be interesting to know if they talked to Kamari Lassiter about him at all. He was a team captain. Yes, he went to Georgia. Yes, he had one moving violation, but it was failure to obey something. It wasn't like reckless driving or something like that. I mean, at this point, it's more notable if a guy from the University of Georgia doesn't have a moving violation, more so than if he does have one. Tight end also, I think I've neglected both on our radio show and here to discuss the tight ends beyond Kenyon Sadiq. Obviously, Kenyon Sadiq went right about where people would have expected it to him in the draft yesterday. But Eli Stowers, former Aggies quarterback, but now tight end with Vanderbilt, and Max Clare, those guys are there. That wouldn't surprise me. I think you look at them. Clare, I think, is looked at as more of a third rounder. Stowers as a second rounder. It would be super competitive in the tight end room if they took Stowers. But you bring in. Oh, why am I blanking on the French name from New Orleans? Apologies to him right now, but because it's been a long freaking day. You got four guys right now there that you look at as being pretty competitive, but between Cade Stover and Brevin Jordan, those guys are in a very competitive, I got to make the roster type of situation right now. And I think Cade Stover has made a lot of progress, but he's also been slowed down by injuries. So this is a big year for him, and we'll see. It wouldn't shock me if they took tight end. The other, you know what, I'll go to linebackers first, and then we'll go to centers after that, or I'll go to defense first. So Jacob Rodriguez, CJ Allen, Jake Galladay, Anthony Hill Jr., Josiah Trotter, Jeremiah Trotter's son, and the brother of the Jeremiah Trotter Jr., who's with the Eagles right now. All of those guys could potentially go in the second or third round. I think that CJ Allen or Jacob Rodriguez, if they take a linebacker at number 38, is probably the most likely. And then at cornerback is still pretty deep right now with some really viable guys. And going back to the depth thing on defense, you might say, well, okay, do we really need to focus anything on defense right now? And I've talked about the edge rusher and how I still think edge rusher in another position. I think there's 5 or 6 guys that could reasonably be drafted in the second round. We remember what happened last year when Kamari Lassiter went out. It was not pretty. It was not pretty whatsoever, not in the slightest. And Jalen Smith, coming off his knee surgery, hopefully really shows something in training camp. But right this moment, I don't feel awesome about just banking on Jalen Smith to end up being a guy that can fill in for Derek Stingley or Kamari Lassiter just if one of those guys goes down. So I would love, there might be some really good opportunity there. It's center, boatload of guys that are definitely cool to take late in the second round or in the third or fourth round. And this is kind of a take your pick. I won't even read their names off. I'd say there's 5 or 6 guys that I'd be comfortable with. Sam Heck is maybe the most polarizing one out of Kansas State because he's a smaller guy, super athletic, gets out in space and does some impressive things. And I vacillate on him because there's part of me that roots for the underdog because he's a smaller guy. Yet at the same time, there's a part of me that gets nervous when we're talking about having a really tough and imposing physical run game, that he's not necessarily part of a huge brute force type of run game. He could be really good in a lot of respects. I'm just, I'm not so, I'll get nervous if they draft him and they expect him to compete immediately. So that's where we are going into the second round tonight. I feel personally very, very good about the Keylan Rutledge pick. I know a lot of you are way more skeptical. The beauty of all of this is that we get to find out over the course of the next 365 days. Well, really, let's over the course of the rest of this calendar year and on into the playoffs, just how good of a pick it was. And I welcome all of you saying in your face if it doesn't work out, as long as you agree to let me triumph and say in your face if it does work out. It's a Bleav in Texans podcast brought to you by FanDuel. Thank you, everybody, for listening or watching. If you're on Apple, please give a 5-star review and some nice comments. If you're watching on YouTube, like and subscribe. Everybody have a great day, and thanks to FanDuel again.